Hi class, it's Mrs. Trevord again. So we are going to dive right into what our unit plan is for Tiger Lily and including a study in Charlotte. So the unit plan is fiction reimagined. So I'm sure you've come to the conclusion now that we're deep into Tiger Lily, that this is a retelling of characters that we're familiar with. Right? A Study in Charlotte was very similar as well. It wasn't a retelling of the same characters, but it was a retelling of the story of Sherlock Holmes, but with new characters that have been reimagined. And that is what we are going to do for this unit. And I'm really, really excited about it. It's going to be a lot of fun. So let's first of all dive into some familiar stories that we probably all know. Does anybody have any guesses what this one is? Think about it to yourself. This is the story of Cinderella. So the story that we're most familiar with is the Disney version of Cinderella, the pretty blue dress, the evil stepmother and stepsisters, and then the beautiful Cinderella. So the story that I'm going to be referring to is from the Brothers Grimm. They compiled many, many, many fairy tales a couple hundred years ago. And one of those was Cinderella. There are actually origins of Cinderella coming before that, the story of Cinderella. There are versions in the Asian cultures. There are versions from Greece. So they kind of took stories that had already been being told verbally for centuries, and they compiled them into a book version for people to be able to read. And so the story of Cinderella, the version that we are familiar with, there's of course the villain, there's the helpful mice and birds, but the real story from the Brothers Grimm is a lot darker. And so the Disney version is actually a reimagining of the Brothers Grimm story. So in the Brothers Grimm story, the dad actually did not die. He doted on the stepdaughters instead of on Cinderella. And she was forced to be a servant, just as she is in the Disney version. But the ending is a little more gruesome that Disney probably did not feel comfortable retelling. So as the prince comes around to place the slipper onto the feet of all of the maidens in the land, the stepmother instructed her daughters to disfigure their feet in order for the shoe to fit. So one stepdaughter cut off her toes, and the other stepdaughter cut off part of her heel in order for these shoes to fit. And pretty gross, right? And so Disney, of course, decided to make it a much more family-friendly ending. So even in the stories we're familiar with, then there have already been reimaginings. So this is another story from the Brothers Grimm, and it is the story of Hansel and Gretel. Most of us are familiar with it. It is a pretty dark story to begin with. And the reason that the children are taken into the forest is because there is a famine and a plague going on, and their stepmother did not want to feed them anymore. She wanted to save herself and the husband from having to feed the children so that they would survive. So they take the kids into the woods. The boy had heard of their plans to abandon the children, and he took white pebbles in his pocket and was dropping them along the way. So as soon as they were abandoned, then they were able to find their way back home. The stepmother found this out when they returned home, and she was furious, and she locked them in their room, and they were not allowed to leave. So then the next time that they were abandoned, the only thing that the boy had was the bread that was in his pocket for their day journey. And so he would leave crumbs as they walked deep into the forest. And the bad thing about crumbs, though, is that there's animals in the forest. And so when they went to return home after they were abandoned, then all the crumbs had been eaten by the animals in the forest. So they were stuck. And these are little kids stuck in a forest. That's pretty dark. That's pretty sad. But then they find their way to a house that is made out of candy and of food. And but in that house is not a good person. It is an evil witch. And she's not just evil, she's also a cannibal. And so she makes Gretel become a slave, and then she puts Hansel in a cage and is feeding him and feeding him and feeding him so that he'll get fat. And he's figuring this out. So when she goes to grab onto his finger to see how fat he's gotten, then he holds out an old chicken bone that's really skinny that keeps him alive for a while because she wants to cook and eat Hansel. So when the time comes, she gets impatient. Then she goes to put Hansel in the oven, and she decides that she wants to cook Gretel too. Pretty gross. But Gretel figures this out, and she is able to push the witch into the stove, into the wood-burning oven, and locks the gate, or locks the door, and they watch the witch burn to death. Pretty dark story. Very dark story. But there's a lot of good characters in this story. There's the witch as the villain. There's the two heroes as the children. There's also a mom or a dad and a stepmom that are not good characters either. But anyway, the kids are able to make their way home. They also found a lot of jewels and money at the witch's house, so they fill their pockets. So they get to go home. The stepmom had died while they were away, and they get to live happily with their dad, living off of the riches that they were able to take from the witch. So that's another story that I was familiar with as a child. It's a pretty dark story. So what we're going to do now, we are going to create a list of all of our fairy tales or stories that we knew growing up or that we're familiar with. This is, of course, due at the end of the day. So there's going to be 2 parts of your quick write. You're going to make a list of those fairy tales. It needs to have at least 5 different stories on there, but you can have as many as you want as long as there are at least 5 different stories listed on that list. And then the second part is that you need to write a paragraph. Remember, 5 to 7 sentences. They need to be complete sentences. You need a proper grammar, proper spelling. And within that paragraph, then you need to summarize the story of your favorite story from when you were younger. So you're creating a list, and then from your list, then you're choosing a favorite. You need to summarize the story, and then you need to also tell me why it was your favorite and who was your favorite character. And so that is going to be your quick write for this next part of our unit. I'm really excited about this. This is going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to really use our imagination, and we're going to be able to dive into the past when we were little children and really analyze those stories that we were told as children. And this is going to be a lot of fun. And I hope you're enjoying the book Tiger Lily. We're right smack dab in the middle of it. And there's a lot of great things happening. Not only is Tiger Lily a fun story, but it's also dealing with things that young people are dealing with today. Now, we may not be being forced into a marriage, but we are definitely faced with a lot of obstacles. And I'm excited to talk to you about those really great things within the story, maybe some more serious subject matter that the story dives into when we get to class. So do this before the end of day, and then when we get to class, then we will just dig right in, and I'll ask some of you to share some of your favorite stories and share why you chose that story. So be prepared to be able to share if you choose to.